We are still in Timothy. Actually, we're coming close to the end of Timothy. We only got about a couple weeks left. And so I'm sort of mourning the entire thing. But I think I already told you, later in the year, we're going to pick up the story in 2 Timothy. It gets much more doctrinal, really cool. I mean, really meaty, wonderful stuff. This is more about interacting with one another in the body, telling Timothy what to do. But here's an interesting one today, because we have another awkward situation, two of them. And we're talking about people like this who are actually quite popular because of how they use their words. So Timothy's going to have to deal with these people. There you go. He's going to have to deal with these people because they carry a great weight in the Greek culture at the time. And it's not really well known about this when we look at what Paul's going to be talking about to Timothy. But there is a whole class of people who make their living on public speaking. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because they start to get into the Christian group and trying to think they can use their public speaking skills for gain, and that's just not right. So Timothy, who's a younger guy, is going to have to confront these people who can very easily sway crowds. So that's where we are today. Apostles' Apprentice. We're looking at Oxit, that's short for awkward situation, number 6 and number 7, which starts in 1 Timothy 6. There's only one more awkward situation after these two, and Paul will spend a gigantic percentage of what's left in chapter 6 talking about that one, and he'll split into two large sections. It's a gigantic, awkward situation he leaves for last. So we'll get to that starting next week. But today, those are not it. It's these instead. So these are awkward situations. These are things that Paul wants Timothy to confront inside the church, and he goes down them categorically. And the first topic is slaves and masters. So, what happens when someone who's a slave comes to Christ, or when a master who owns slaves comes to Christ? So I know Timothy's saying, oh, I know what you say. You say, masters, free your slaves. But Paul doesn't say that. But you would think this would be the time to do that, right? So let's see what he does say. Thanks, Timmy. Get off the screen. Okay, here we go. Verse 1, chapter 6. So let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor. And he doesn't use the word slave like we do, but bondservants and yoke, that's what a slave is. So you remember what a yoke is? A yoke is what you put on your oxen when they pull your plow. It's a way of telling the oxen that, buddy, Mr. Ox, today you're doing my job, not your own. So a yoke is always a symbol of having to work for somebody else. And it's a burdensome yoke. Although Jesus said, my yoke is easy, it's light. So it's a different kind of thing. So in a real sense, once you come to Christ, you're not working for yourself. You're actually enslaved to Him. But the yoke is an easy one. And we could spend all morning talking about that. But that's what we're talking here. Slaves, bondservants, regard their own masters as worthy of all honor. So he's addressing the slaves. And he's saying, look, this is what you need to do. You need to honor the people who own you. What? That's wrong. Isn't Jesus supposed to tell me I'm freed from the oppression of my masters, and I need to break free, and I need liberty and free? Isn't Jesus all about freedom? He said, if I know the truth, it'll set me free. So, what? Right? Chill your jets just a little bit. We'll talk about this. He says, so that there's a repercussion to this. You need to honor and respect your masters, so that, this is where I love to stop and ask, what's the downside if you don't respect your master? What's the really big, bad side if you don't do this? I mean, what if they're nasty? What if they're very unjust masters? Am I still supposed to do this? Because he said he didn't qualify it. You notice that? You need to honor them. So if I don't do it, what's the downside? If I do it, what's the upside? So Paul's going to start right now saying, okay, I'll tell you the consequences. You need to honor your master, and I'll tell you the consequences. And they're bigger than you might think. And here's what they are. Wow. That the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. That's the entire teaching of the gospel. What? You need to honor your masters so that our message about who God is and about what the gospel is all about will not be reviled, which means people spit out and go, I hate it. You mean if all I have to do is honor my master? Yes. You mean just good masters, right? No. All masters. So there's a huge principle going right here. And you can apply this to yourself. You say, well, we're not slaves, but you are employees, many of us. That's the modern day equivalent of what we're talking about here. He's saying that there's some kind of cosmic divine consequence about communicating the nature of God and the nature of the gospel by honoring the people that employ you. What? Well, we could spend a ton of time on this, but you get the picture if you remember what Jesus did in the upper room before they had the Passover dinner. He washed their feet. And Jesus on that occasion and other occasions said, look, I didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give my life a ransom for many. So there is a sense in which the core revealed nature of God in Jesus is one who comes to serve for our benefit. So if you indeed are a follower of that divine servant, then that quality ought to be replicated in you. If you walk around real huffy saying, well, this is below me, I deserve much better than this, I know what my time is worth. This is junk. I'm here, then you're not really acting like Jesus, because Jesus didn't do that. He stripped down and put something on his waist and he washed their feet. So the Christian idea of communicating God has a huge component is communicating the fact that our God is a God who came to serve so that we might be saved. That is gigantic. You don't see that in any other religion. In fact, he came not only to wash feet, but he made himself like mankind, his creation, and he suffered and died. That's how far down he went in serving. So that's a fundamental core part of the gospel, is that we have a God who loves us so much that he came and died on our behalf. So that's why this is huge. If you get all huffy and you say, I'm better than this and my master's a jerk and I don't need to honor him, then you actually are impugning the name of God and the entire corpus of teaching about the gospel. Wow. Now, before we go too far, and we'll get the hardest conviction part out of the way, this applies to you as an employee and has nothing to do with the justness or the lovability of your employer. There's something about communicating the gospel that is strongly reinforced by honoring the people that employ you. Strongly reinforced. Not just a little bit. I mean, he could have just said, you need to do this so that people will see that you're nice and you're a lovely person. He doesn't say it. He says, we're talking about the entire character of God and the entire truth corpus of the gospel being impugned. It's a big deal. Big deal. So don't let this roll off without noticing that this is a big deal. Okay. Well, those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers. So here's another twist to the thing. It seems like, okay, I will knuckle under and I will honor my master even though he's not just. But what if I have not only a just master, but I have a believing master who's also a disciple of Jesus? Well, then that puts us as peers. And so now I don't really have to work very hard for him. And that's what was coming in right here. See, he says it exactly. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers. It seems kind of backwards. It seems like you would be disrespectful of an unjust and an unbelieving master. But we're tempted to say that because Christ, which is true, because Christ makes us all peers, none of us is above anyone else, you cannot go to your employer or your master and say, you know what, you're not better than me, so I don't have to serve you anymore. That was never the purpose of serving, was because someone was better and someone was lesser. That's never it. Indeed, we are all on the same plane when it comes to Christ. We have one master and then us. But it's not about serving someone because they're perceived as being on a higher level than you and you're on a lesser. That's not it at all. Service happens anyway. Because again, you come back to Jesus washing feet, and this is the creator God of the universe who is above all this, literally. And yet he's doing this. So unbelieving masters I can see, but believing masters, don't be tempted to be disrespectful. We would tend to do this. We would cut corners. If I was working at Wendy's and I was bussing tables and I knew that my boss was a believer, I'd push the edges a little bit, because after all, he can't condemn me because, hey, we're both lovers of Jesus. You end up kind of cutting back on that. No, in fact, you need to serve all the more. You need to serve all the more. Rather, they must serve all the better. since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved. So again, even though we're peers, because Christ has made us peers for what Christ has done on our behalf, there's only one hierarchy in the kingdom of God. It's Jesus, and then there's us. Totally across the board. Still, the idea is that service is still a gigantic issue. Just a gigantic issue. And it benefits the person who you're serving. That's why you need to do it. So again, this is fascinating. Now, I would expect at this point that Jesus would flip over, through Paul would flip over and he would start talking about bad masters. He doesn't. In fact, that's all he talks about on slaves. What? That's unjust. There's so much about slavery we need to talk about. But did you notice he only addressed half of the slave master thing? Who did he not address? Masters. There are no masters talked about in here. And yet you would think, if I was writing the Bible, I would write about slavery by talking to the masters and saying, masters, you need to get off your high horse. You need to treat people really well. You need to, you're the one that's wrong with this situation. But Paul is saying to Timothy, you need to deal with slaves who are wrong, even when they have believing masters. Wow. Because the whole idea of why you serve is twisted upside down in the present economy, not only now, but even back then. You serve because you serve out of love. You don't serve because one person's above the other. That's just not it at all. But he doesn't talk about masters at all. There's no master talk here at all. And that's a little disconcerting to a lot of people. Because they look at the history of slavery in America and actually worldwide. Slavery was just a common economic artifact up until the 19th century worldwide. And you look at the injustice of that, and that is a great injustice. And injustice isn't just the fact that some masters were cruel, because they were. And it's not the fact that people's lives are stolen from them and they can't have their own lives. That's true as well. But there is a sense in which if Paul is going to instruct Timothy about slavery, why does he not push for the abomination of slavery? Why doesn't he do something more radical than this? All he basically says, slaves, serve well, and if your masters are good and believers, serve all the more. That doesn't, where's the injustice in all this stuff? Well, Paul's coming at it from the point that a slave can be an incredible testimony to the nature of God and the nature of the gospel. He's looking at the offense rather than the defense when he's talking slavery. Slavery can be an incredible vehicle to talk about the God who serves on our behalf. That's all Paul was interested in. Now, there is injustice, and it's hard to understand why it is Paul didn't just jump right in with both feet. A lot of contemporary critics of the Bible will say there's slavery all through the Bible, and when Paul had the perfect chance to talk about it and abolish it, he didn't do it. AKA 1 Timothy 6. He didn't do it. So how just can Christianity be when none of their sacred documents say anything about abolishing it? That's the argument you'll get. However, it's a little more complex than that, because this is wrong. But when slavery finally changed in the Western world, who led the charge against slavery? Guys like this, William Wilberforce in England. A very bold, outspoken evangelical Christian. He came to Christ in his late 20s. And at that point, he said, this is wrong. We got to change something. He went on a multi-decade crusade to get rid of slavery, to change how Britain saw slavery. He worked at this. He was actually brought in by a handful of other people who said, we've been trying all this time to try and get people to understand that slavery is fundamentally wrong. And yet it was the economic backbone of Western civilization. What do? So Wilberforce went out, godly man, and took a lot of bullets for this. Rhetorically speaking, it was tough. It was really tough. The Christian community is one that led the tip of the spear in terms of changing slavery in the West. And Wilberforce was probably the tip of the spear. Now, he's English, and what he did was he eventually got the House of Commons there to pass a law in 1807, the Slave Trade Act. And so in 1807, they finally said, well, you know what? We can't go as far as abolishing slavery, but we can say we're going to stop trading slaves. But the existing slaves that are owned, well, we'll talk more about that later. So then he redoubled his efforts to somehow get rid of that altogether. The Christian community, again, became the larger tip of the spear once the Trade Act went in place. And it wasn't until 33. See how long it took? 1833, they finally passed the Slavery Abolition Act, led by Christians. No kidding. Led by Christians against a culture that was just asleep about the nature and the injustice of slavery. It was the Christians that did this. So there is an ethic in Christianity that really does say the person is made in the image of God. We need to treat them that way, and that was the argument they made for all those years. However, before I go too far past this, in America, when we were discussing slavery, the Democratic South and Republican North both used the Bible to justify their stand on pro-slavery, anti-slavery. I mean, it was a very ugly debate. It was really ugly. Christians on both sides were doing this. But it took to 33, fortunately, to finish Wilberforce's story. Wilberforce, he got pretty sick in the 30s, 1830, 31, 32, 33. In 33, he was on his deathbed. They passed the Abolition Act against slavery 3 days before he died. But he heard it happen. In fact, they hadn't voted on it, but he says, we're assured we have the votes, this is going to happen. And in a sense, he said, great, what God led me to do all my entire life has finally happened. Now, in American history in 1833, we're not even up to the Civil War. But Britain had said, we're no longer trading slaves. We're no longer employing slaves. We've freed those slaves because it's morally wrong. And America said, we don't care. We need slaves. It was the Christian communities in both places that really led the charge in many respects. So I think when you talk about slavery and our contemporary condemnation from people, yes, Paul didn't condemn it. It was an artifact of every ancient culture, every modern culture. It was just part of life in that sense. But finally, because of the truth of the Bible, Christians said, wait, every person, man and woman, is made in the image of God. We've got to stop this. And the Christian community stopped it. And Wilberforce, to this day, if you go visit England and you go to Westminster Abbey, that statue right there, that was made 7 years after Wilberforce died. They put it in Westminster Abbey in 1840, and it's there to this very day. And at the bottom of the pedestal that it talks about, this was a guy who followed God's leading, his Christian beliefs that every man is made in the image of God and slavery was wrong, and against all odds, he pushed to free slaves. And he did. So we should be against slavery, but Paul's saying that in the midst of the economic reality of slavery, how should a slave act? They ought to work hard. They ought to honor their masters.
They should.
They should. And so should employees. By the way, Simpson, who's an interesting Bible commentator, he talks about what a mistake it would have been for the Christian community to push to abolish slavery at the time and how that would have wrecked the progress of the gospel. It's an interesting historical thing if you want to read more. But he says Christianity's spiritual campaign, that's the movement of the gospel, Christianity's spiritual campaign would have been fatally compromised by stirring the smoldering embers of class hatred into a devouring flame or opening an asylum for runaway slaves in its bosom. Because at the time in the first century, the Roman elites were scared to death that the slaves would have a political uprising because they were so numerous, and they would take down the entire Roman state. There was a constant, that's the smoldering embers, the constant smoldering class bitterness about this. Rome was scared to death. So if the Christians had come out talking about the gospel, talking about who Jesus is, and said, we're also here to abolish slavery, the whole movement of the gospel would have been shut down in a heartbeat for economic and political purposes. Now, Christianity went into a huge era starting after Nero of being persecuted for 250 years. But it wasn't the perception that they were coming to bring political change that caused that persecution. What brought the persecution was the fact that they promoted Christ. And the abolition of slavery would have diluted that message. A lot of historians look at it and say, although it seems like they should have gone out and campaigned against slavery, it would have totally torpedoed the advance of the gospel in the first century. Until 18 centuries later, God moved him to do it. So it's just interesting timing. Okay, let's get out of slavery for a while. If you want to read more about slavery in the New Testament, these are all the places. And I encourage you to do that because they're fascinating. They're really pretty fascinating. In only one of them does he address masters. He always addresses slaves. There's theology in that. Okay, so just take a look at that. By the way, Philemon, the little book of Philemon, that's all about slavery because Philemon was a slave owner. Wow. Okay, we got to move on. So anyway, Paul goes on and he tells Timothy, so you need to teach and urge these things. You need to do this with slaves. Which reminds him then to go to the next awkward situation, number 7. And it has to do with this guy who's doing this motivational speech here. Because at the time, there was a thing in Greek culture where the Greeks just loved to hear someone in public speak. Remember when Paul goes to Athens? In Acts, and he goes to Athens, and they say, wow, what you're talking about, we need to put you on the stage here in the Areopagus, and you need to tell us, because this sounds like great stuff. They were big into this, and so there was actually a gigantic culture of motivational speakers that went around the world, and people would pay them to speak in public settings. Just like this, the Tony Robbins of the first century. And we're like these guys, because these guys get paid to talk, and they're entertaining, and they create a crowd. It's exactly the same thing. This was going on in first century Palestine because of the Greek culture, the Greek influences, which started all the way back with the philosophers like Aristotle and those guys who would speak publicly, and people ate it up. By the time you get to the time of Jesus, this was a gigantic industry. Guys going around, impressing large audiences, coming into town and saying, listen, I got news to tell you, and they would talk about the wisdom that they had garnered from their Greek society. And this was just gigantic, and they made a very healthy living doing this. These guys that went around didn't quite do it like this, they did it more like this. They would come into a town and they would start speaking, they would gather crowds. The crowds would get all worked up and enjoy these guys. These guys were called sophists. Soph, which always in Greek means wisdom. They were wisdomists. This is what these guys did. And they would come into town, total strangers, and just start speaking. And people would gather around them and go, yeah, yeah, and they'd work up the crowd. And when they would get done, they'd have these people giving them money, saying, if you support what I'm doing, give me some cash. Sounds kind of like modern politics in some ways. But there's a way in which this was the public entertainment medium. This was the culture. And when you get to Ephesus, where Timothy is sitting, this was a gigantic piece of the culture in Ephesus. Gigantic piece of the culture. So now, there's a problem here because some of these guys who are making a living talking about Greek philosophy and Greek sophistry and wisdom suddenly realized they had a new an emerging audience. And who is this new emerging audience? The followers of Jesus. So if I can work my way into bringing, some kind of Christian wisdom, then I can kind of renew my calling and I can make money off of these new Christians. Yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll become a spiritual, religious, sort of Christian, sort of Jewish sort of speaker, and then they'll pay me money, and this will be the best thing ever because these people, they are cranked up. Ooh, yeah. And this is what we have happening that Paul's talking to. This is what we're talking about. These sophists that would come in these areas. And they would say crazy things like this. Faith activates God, and fear activates the enemy. That is a true quote from Joel Osteen. And they would say things, you'd listen to it and go, yeah, what? And if you were taught biblically, if you'd heard what Paul had been teaching, what Timothy had been teaching, and what was coming out of the Scriptures, you'd hear that and go, it sounds right, but something's not right with it. Even that phrase right there, you go, it sounds right, but it sounds right enough for people to follow the person and give them money. And that's all these guys who traveled around, these sophists did. They would do that. So they would listen enough to the Christian doctrines. They'd pull out some of the right words. They would appropriate the words thinking they know what it is. They'd put together a masterful kind of what looks like wise slice of religious speaking. And they'd stick it out there and people would go, yeah. What? And this is what these guys did. By the way, this is what goes on today too. Just saying, this goes on today. You have to be so on your toes. And the only thing that protects you from being duped by some of these guys is by having your eyes in the Word. That's really the only thing that sets off the alarm bells when you hear this kind of stuff. And I got to tell you, even though in the first century the sophists were a big industry and they were very influential, very charismatic speakers, it is in spades today. I mean, it's more today than ever before. You have to be on your toes. You have to be on your toes. And when someone tells you something, sort of like this phrase, that something inside of you says, yeah, I want to believe. Boy, that feels right. You didn't go far enough in analyzing it. You can't do that. On the internet, when someone says something on the internet, they pass something along, it might be fourth hand or fifth hand, you go, yeah, I'm sure that's true. Yeah, because it's what you want to hear. And they know that, and they can make bucks off of your clicking doing it. It's exactly the same thing as the sophists in the first century. You've got to be on your toes and go, well, I don't know. I think I'll reserve judgment for a little bit. Because they know what you want to hear. This is what the public is built on today. And the internet was kind of like gasoline on a fire of manipulating people by telling them what they want to hear. Now you and I can make money on the internet by propagating stuff that people want to hear, that people click on and want to read more. So, I mean, I'm just telling you, it's a big, bad world out there, and a lot has to do with what you believe and what this is all about. You got to be on your toes. You just got to be on your toes. So anyway, Paul's trying to tell Timothy, you need to deal with these guys. Whoa, what? Well, these guys, they're masters of what they do. Okay, so here's how we're going to do it. Verse 3. So, if anyone teaches a different doctrine and does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus the Messiah and the teaching that accords with godliness, then, oh yeah, Paul, what are you going to do then? Huh? Timothy, what are you going to do? Huh? But before we see what the consequences are, look what he says. We've seen some of these words before, so I won't dwell on them too much. If they don't agree with sound words, remember the word sound we saw earlier in 1 Timothy is this word that looks in Greek like the word hygiene. It's actually almost spelled the same as hygiene. And hygiene literally means things that bring health or wellness is what it is. It's health giving. So what he's saying is that, and this is a great adjective to use here, he doesn't use it all the time. He's saying that the words that we're speaking about aren't just wise and interesting and, compelling. They actually bring health. And the truth from God is intended for that, to bring health in your life. So that's what he's saying. If they don't agree with the health-giving words that Jesus, it comes from Jesus, and the teaching that accords with godliness, again, godliness, the Eusebia, this whole idea about the life that's lived in connection and relationship with God, that's the entire life that you see that's connected with God and following Jesus, that's Eusebia, that's godliness. So all the teaching about how to walk with God on a daily basis, how to trust Him for your needs, it's that whole package. That's what godliness means here. It means what your life looks like when you rely on God. That's just all it means. So he says if they're against all of that stuff, if they go against all of that stuff and it doesn't agree with that, he's puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. I love how Paul does that. So he's saying, look, they're not just deluded. They're not just deluded. They're not just undertaught, which is how I would kind of, benefit of the doubt. No, they're conceited, which means it's all about them. They're promoting this stuff because of the benefit of what it does to them. But in the bottom line, they don't know anything. Zero. Zip. Nothing. Paul uses a really big word right here. He doesn't say that they're just kind of off track. He's saying that everything they're saying is false. They don't know anything. And again, this is what the professional guys would do when they'd come into town. They'd hear a smattering of religious words. They'd stick them together in a kind of a compelling religious narrative that sort of makes sense. And since the religious words connect with people who come out of that religious experience, they'd put it out there and people would go, yeah. And the charisma of these guys was such that they would line up with them and say, yeah, that's exactly what I want to believe too. And Paul says they don't know anything. Zip. I mean, he really, this is about as abusive as you can get. These guys, we talk about many times that there's spiritual counterfeits afoot amongst us in the world. And the counterfeits are cleverly put together so that they're like about 90% real truth and about 10% error. And so when you spot the 90% truth, your defenses are down, your guards are down. And then when they sneak in the other 10% that's error, you go, well, yes, so okay. And that's how counterfeit works. But he's saying that these guys are worse than counterfeiters that way. They don't know anything. I mean, it's like zero. These guys are totally clueless. So I think it's really interesting that Paul uses this very bold statement to sort of embolden Timothy. So he can go up to him and say, hey guys, You don't know anything. You don't know anything. And by the way, you're in this just for what it does for you. Conceit. What it does for you. There's a lot of self-help guys in the world today that I wonder really about how good their advice and their wisdom is, but I know it's making them rich. And in the end, when I analyze what they say, I'm just very careful and thoughtful. I want to be analytical. I look at it and I take it apart and go, that's nothing. That's nothing. There's nothing here. This is, okay, but you can still make money off people because they'll buy into that. So this is what it looks like when you're puffed up. I asked Timothy to do his impression of puffed up people. There it is. That's what it looks like to be puffed up. Thanks. Go away. Okay. So then they're puffed up with conceit. They understand nothing. Paul's really laying on the line about how you need to deal with these people. In fact, these people, he has an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels about words. Now we're getting into internet land. This is internet land. Because you do not make money on the internet by people clicking on you if you're just agreeable and kind of halfway. You make money on the internet when you do exactly this. Now, not everybody, but the ones who are pundits with words, they look for cravings for controversies, quarrels about words. Controversies, quarrels. Controversies, quarrels. If you wonder why the gigantic percentage of the discussion on the internet is all about controversies and quarrels, it's because that makes money. And controversies and quarrels can be elucidated by just putting out factual errors. I mean, you can say anything you want to, and you can get people to not only buy your side because they want to be angry too, but it starts the controversy. And then people start going around and saying, well, I don't think that's true. I'm going to fact check that. And the controversy goes on, and this whole thing snowballs. Everyone who's fact checking is making money as you click and follow them. Everyone who's making the assertions, they're making money as you click and follow. This is a gigantic portion of how you make money on the internet. It's this. And this is how these guys made money when they came into town. They would say something totally outrageous. And by the way, the more outrageous, the more money you make. I mean, you don't go half outrageous, go way over the top outrageous. There are aliens living on the dark side of the moon. I've got pictures. Don't go little. Don't say, they were here 100 years ago, or, they left behind a stone that looks like a face. You got to say they lived there. You got to go way over the top. And so people would come up to these guys in the squares. They make these claims. And people say, what are you talking about? That's just nutsoid, man. Controversy. That's crazy. Have you got any evidence for that? Oh, tons of it. I can't show you most of it because I have a security clearance from the government. But I just want to let you know. That it's true. Trust me, it's there. Wow! And so you just see the flames start to go up in the controversy. These guys make their money publicly by causing quarrels and controversy. So what they do from a religious sense, since they know their audience is religious, and since they've appropriated religious words that you're comfortable with, right? Well, the aliens on the moon, they're all about sanctification. They're all about grace and faith. So if you want to find where salvation truly is, look on the dark side of the moon, and you can understand redemption like no one else. What are you talking about, buddy? So these controversies would go on like this, and they would know how to get you with the familiar words, and then cause the controversy and quarrel by claiming the most radical things. Oh, Jesus? He never died on the cross. He just swooned. And so what happened was they took him off the cross while he was still alive. And of course, when they put him in a cool tomb, the coolness, he would revive, and he'd sit up and say, I'm feeling better now. And then he would figure out how to roll the stone away, which would take a small village to move. And he would come out and say, here I am, and he'd fool everybody. Analytical thinking kind of takes that down in a heartbeat. But this is the kind of thing these guys would do. They would bring out the controversy, they'd start the quarrel, and that would guarantee that they would be in place in front of these people for longer than if they just came and said something kind of milquetoasty. They're into quarrels and in fact, they crave it. That's such a great English translation. They crave it. They crave it. In the same way that you crave chocolate. Amen. Okay, I got an amen. The same way you crave chocolate, they crave controversy. And as soon as the audiences would bite on that, they're having their chocolate experience. Oh, yes. And what does it do? Well, it produces envy, for one thing, people wishing they had the truth. It produces dissension as people engage on the controversy. With the two different sides, the dissension happens. It produces slander. It eventually reduces, boy, is this internet, it reduces down to not talking about the topic at hand. It comes down to slandering the person who's saying it and slandering the people who resist it. Oh yeah, well you're a, right? Yeah. Stay away from people who resort to slander because they don't have an argument. It also comes with evil suspicion. So a lot of people then would start to entertain evil ideas that they thought were way out of bounds, and now they're not anymore. And we actually then, not only that, but we start assigning, this is very internet-y, we start assigning evil to people. They are responding like this because we're good, they're evil. Have you seen any of that on the internet? Yeah, that is like, boy. Wow, talk about prophecy. This is today. So they start not only slander the person for what their character is, but you actually assign to them that their base motivation for everything they say that's opposing me is evil. Evil. And then at that point, you can take any tactic you want in resisting them. For instance, if you claim that Hitler is evil, and I think he was, there's good evidence to prove that he was evil. Well, when you put someone in the evil camp, then you can use any resource in your bag of tricks to resist them, including violence. And so in the present dialogues, we have violence as the next step in proclaiming certain groups of people evil. And that's just the way it goes. I read this list and I went, oh my gosh, I need to pin this to the side of my computer display because this is what's going on inside that tube all the time with what's being presented to me. Slander, evil suspicions, and constant friction among people who are depraved in mind and deprived of the truth. Internet. I just was shocked when I read it. I was shocked. But look, the deal is that even though the technology has changed from the first century, the techniques about how these guys would promote their controversies and hence actually make money by sponsoring controversy and quarrel, those human motivations haven't changed in 2,000 years. They just haven't changed. They just haven't changed. We just have a better vehicle to do it today. So, someone can be sitting in their basement with their computer and they can start making cash on doing this rather than having to walk from village to village like they did in the first century. By doing this kind of stuff. But his characterization of them is it's astonishing to me. They are depraved in mind, which means they're looking for ugly, immoral things. They're looking for that. They're looking for the uglies in the world. That's the depraved mind. And they're deprived of the truth. Now, if they were not deprived of the truth, that is biblical truth, if they weren't deprived of the truth, they could easily diffuse almost any of this junk that's coming out of their computer screen. I mean, really. And the people who are listening to these guys who come into town, they could diffuse that as well. What do you mean Jesus swooned? Do you know anything about crucifixion, buddy? Have you ever seen a crucifixion? Have you ever seen how they're up there and they're gasping for their breath and they can't get their breath because they can't support themselves, and then finally they suffocate because they can't push up with their legs, and that they actually broke the legs of Jesus so he couldn't push up and take a breath? Do you know anything about crucifixion? Did you know they stabbed him in the side of the spear? Who are you, buddy? You don't know anything. What's that? They didn't break his legs. They wanted to. They broke the other two guys. I'm just talking about crucifixion in general. Yeah. So the whole idea is that if you know biblical truth, you can diffuse a lot of the stupid arguments. Because the stupid arguments, although they are compelling and they're given charismatically, they have no basis in truth. They know nothing. So if you're deprived of truth, you're a sitting duck. You're a sitting duck. Now, let me just expand it a little bit beyond just biblical stuff. This is true in general in the discourses that go in our public today. Some of them are scientific discussions. If you don't know the science, maybe you need to get out of the discussion. If you don't, there's a lot of things that things will be proposed that don't really have any basis in fact, and you may be deprived of truth in some of those things. And in those cases where you are deprived of truth in those things where they're debating, just say, well, I don't know. I do this a lot in discussions online. Someone will propose something and I'll say, well, I don't know anything about that. That's not my specialty. Could be true, might not be true. I don't know. Bye. You just got to let it go. Which, by the way, seems like an easy thing to do, but it's not, because they've already hooked you with the craziness of it. You just need to say, no, I'm not going to do that. Okay. Now, why would these people do this? And that's how Paul finishes this awkward situation, number 7. Why would people deliberately do this? Well, because they imagine that godliness is a means of gain. So we already mentioned this. Godliness that is looking godly, not actually being godly, but presenting themselves as the paragon of godliness when they come into town and, talk as they do. Because they imagine that somehow I can make money on this. And that's the gain he's talking about. He's not talking about gain and reputation. This is the word that's always used for money. It's always used for money. So they imagine that this is a way to make money. It's gross. It's just gross. And when you think about the fact that someone's coming in to deliberately detour you from the truth of the gospel, the truth of who Jesus is, because they can actually make money at it, it makes you sick. This is exactly what these guys did. And this is exactly what goes on the internet and the general culture today. Making money off of denying timeless truths. Timeless truths. And truths that are just gigantic treasures of doctrine and truth are being compromised for a fast buck. So just beware of that. By the way, too, I don't know if you know much about the mechanics of the internet, but I'll tell you, there's a lot of honest people on the internet. They sell honest things, gives them a market that's just wonderful. It's wonderful in that sense. It's a great access to the information. Some of it's really good. I don't want to do all that. But there is a sense in which you may not know that you can, if you have a channel that works really well, you can actually make money, fractional money, pennies, on every click that someone does when they click into your website. Did you know that? They actually get a paycheck out of how this works, visibility to ads and stuff like that. So someone who has 1 million followers, when you give a fraction of a penny for every click from every follower in what you've got there, you're highly motivated to put stuff on there that causes controversies and quarrels. So I got to let you know, as a consumer, you're being used when it comes to some of these things. But there's some great stuff on the internet as well. But anyway, these guys see this as a means of gain. That's all that they do. Okay, let me do a closing comment, because this triggered something. These guys who come into town and do this kind of crazy stuff, that's at work today, that it's eating into the edges of Christianity. And I got to say this very delicately. I'm not talking about crazy preachers on TV, although we could go there. They're pretty obvious. Most of us have defenses set up against them. We weigh them more carefully. But there's another thing going on. I'm going to just say this really carefully. There's a growing number of modern professional Christian intellectuals. And some of these guys they're godly people, they're good, but what they do is they end up taking the gospel and they say things that are controversial and quarrelsome, hoping it'll cause a little controversy in the Christian intellectual camp, knowing that if they say something that's a little askew and they can support it with magnitudes of scriptures, they know they will capture an attention inside the Christian community. This goes on, and it's not, I won't say it's acute or it's just really way over the top like TV preachers are, but it's happening kind of in an elite intelligentsia in Christianity. I've got 14 letters after my name from all the places I've gone to school. I know better than you, so when Paul says this, he means this. He says, well, that's crazy talk. Yeah, but I can show you all the passages. Well, and then they get in debates with other guys of the same ilk, and these guys have professional ministries that are based on just arguing over the scriptures. Where it seems to me that there's a great treasure in the scriptures that's being stepped over. Because they're using this as fodder for their discussions, and the quarrels for them is career beneficial. And I'm not going to name any names, but this is starting to creep in. And there's ways to see this happening. I'll just say a couple things about this. There are topics like these that get put on the table, and there's a professional class of Christian academics who like to be seen as people who argue these things well and cause controversies and beat each other with sticks and stuff like that. And these topics are really, they're just fascinating to talk about. Calvinism is probably one of the most classic ones on that list. You'll get people hitting each other with sticks about Calvinism. And some people who take great pride in the fact that they have 14 degrees after their name, and they can defend or attack Calvinism better than somebody else, and they go at loggerheads, and let's have a debate, and all these people will fill the hall. There's a little of this syndrome coming in when you do this, because they're debating about stuff which, to me, is just profoundly valuable, and they're using it as fodder for debate. And there's something about this that's just troubling to me. And I'm not alone on that. Let me give you some quotes. This guy, Melanchthon, he was at the beginning of the Reformation. He was actually a guy that worked with Martin Luther. Melanchthon is a guy, he doesn't get enough credit. He's probably the first systematic theologian that existed. He helped Luther put his words on paper. Melanchthon, he's a thinking guy of the Reformation. And he said, to know Christ is not to speculate about the mode of his incarnation, but to know his saving benefits. And see, that's what I'm talking about here. During the Reformation especially, there was huge professional academic debate about what the Scripture said. And Melanchthon was one of the guys who could have gone in there and debated as good as anybody else. But he says, wait, we're forgetting about the fact that we're debating something that has tremendous value by itself. This is not fodder for discussion. This is the priceless treasure of God's truth. This is Melanchthon who said this. He's a guy I would expect to abuse this. Another guy, I'd never read this before until I did some research this week. This guy J.S. Whale, an English theologian. He did a talk of 8 lectures in a university in England right at the beginning of World War II. And the lectures were called Christian Doctrine. He just spoke these and they transliterated them. I'll have to translate this a little bit because there's some English ease that you might not... He spoke these in 1941 and we were better educated too in 1941. But he said, we have, as Valentine said of Thurio, an exchequer of words but no other treasure. Okay, Valentine said of Thurio, Two Gentlemen of Verona, Shakespeare, and in the middle of Two Gentlemen of Verona, there's this incredible insult fest that goes on in the middle of Gentlemen of Verona. I mean, it's classically great. This is Shakespeare having these two guys, Valentine and Thurio, just duking it out, slapping each other with words. It's masterful. If Shakespeare wrote this, I would never want to get in an argument with Shakespeare because he could just take you apart with his words because he gave these guys these words. It's a great insult fest that's going on. Just great. And so one guy says, listen, if you want to go to battle with me with words, this is Thurio talking, if you want to go with me to battle with words, I've got a whole treasury. I've got so many words I can just totally outblast you because I've got like the treasury of an entire country of words. That's what an exchequer is. It's the country's treasury. I've got a whole treasury of words. So if you want to come, I will bankrupt you with my treasury of words that I've got. This is Thurio. This is like one of the slaps, like that. And so Valentine comes back with this thing. He says, okay, so you have an exchequer of words, but there's really no other treasure in what you're talking about. There's no treasure in what you're talking about. You may have lots of words, but there's no treasure. There's no value to the word. Okay, that's how Wales starts his condemnation of professional arguing Christians. He says it's like what Valentine said to Thurio. Sure, you've got an exchequer of words, but there's no other treasure. So he says, this is Whale now, instead of putting off our shoes from our feet because the place whereon we stand is holy ground, we're taking nice photographs of the burning bush from suitable angles. We're chatting about theories of the atonement with our feet on the mantelpiece instead of kneeling down before the wounds of Christ. Is that the best quote ever? Okay, and so this is the creeping sophist influence into the Christian community today. There are those who occupy this stratosphere of professional argumentation in the Christian community. I won't name any names. I just see it as a trend which I find very disturbing. I just find it really disturbing. I love to talk with people who love the Lord about topics like the Trinity and about redemption. But I'm not doing this as a profession to create controversy and quarrels. I'm doing this because I just love to explore the ideas. Love to, because there's such a treasure to me. And there's three ways that I use when I hear some of these things going on to tell me whether or not what I'm seeing is someone who loves the Word or someone who just likes to make money debating the Word. Okay? And those three things, and I'll leave you with this. These are the three things I ask. I ask the things they're talking about. Do I see wonder in their voices? Wonder about the truth of that? I mean, even with the Trinity, the idea of the Trinity. Okay, the word Trinity is not in the Bible, but the concept is there very strongly, even though we invented the word as a shorthand to carry it around. But can you imagine the idea that the God who made everything came in the flesh? What? There should be a little wonder in that thought. Just a little bit of wonder. And that after he dies and he resurrects, at the end of Matthew he says, I'll be with you always, even to the end of the age. He's talking about the Holy Spirit. Now, if that doesn't create some kind of wonder in you, then you're just debating the academic pros and cons of the Trinity, but not really treasuring it. See what I'm saying? So there should be some wonder. If I don't sense wonder in someone's debates about religious topics, maybe they're doing it because they like the quarrel. You see what I'm saying? There's another measure. I've got 3 W words. Wonder. Another one is wisdom. Do I actually see wisdom in what they're saying? Or do I see just a debate? But do I see wisdom coming out? Do I see wisdom coming out? You know, in the Trinity, it's wisdom to think about the fact that this God who's clearly outside of our universe and outside of our experience, because he made it. There's wisdom in the fact that he realized that to establish a relationship with his creatures, he'd have to become one of them. Now, there is tremendous wisdom in that. So if the wisdom isn't there in the discussions, is there wonder, is there wisdom, and then finally is there worship? So do I see their words leading me to worship? Does it bring me to a point where I say, wow, what a God we have? That he would not sit off in the distant universe and say, good luck, hope things work out for you. But he took the initiative. He became a person. He came and experienced everything we experience, even down to childhood. He experienced everything we experienced for the sole purpose of the fact that we might come to understand who God is and that we might be reconciled to him because of our sins. Now that takes me to worship. So again, this is just my 3 W's I use when I hear these debates going on. And I might be exposed to more of them than you are. But when I see a lot of these debates go on at this very high, semi-elite academic level, I listen to these and say, guys, where's the wonder about the truths you're dealing with? I mean, you're taking pictures of the burning bush from different vantage points. I mean, come on. Doesn't this inspire any kind of wonder? Doesn't this inspire any kind of worship, any kind of wisdom and all that? Is there any of that there? I almost never hear these conversations end with, I don't know, but man, what a God we've got. No, they go away saying who won the argument. So I'm just saying, that's actually a cultural influence from our debating culture moving its way into the higher levels of academic Christianity. And it makes me sad. But the interesting thing about the gospel is that any of us can grasp it. Any of us can plumb to a depth that will never be exhausted. And you can sit around the dinner table and say, let's talk about the incarnation. Isn't this thing? Do you think Jesus ever experienced this? I wonder how he dealt with this. Isn't it great that he did that and I can't say you don't understand what I'm going through? I mean, isn't that great? See, we can explore these things, and there's no depth to the gospel that you will ever exhaust. It's a limitless, wonderful expanse of truth and wisdom that you can spend your entire life in exploring and just have a wonderful time, because the character and nature of God displayed in who he is and what he's done is infinitely explorable by you, and in fact, you will explore it the rest of eternity. That's an amazing thing. We don't have to get into debates that provide our paycheck about who wins and who loses when we talk about the academic pros and cons of the Trinity. Okay? I've dwelt on that way too long. But it's my way of saying you need to, remember I said you need to be vigilant, you need to be careful, you need to be analytical, you need to look carefully. Well, what Paul was seeing and telling Timothy to take initiative on was things that were pretty apparent. We see those same kind of effects when we look at TV preachers other thing. We see all that kind of stuff. But it's happening at a more subtle level than any of you or I can really understand. You are constantly culturally influenced by it in the internet. And it's seeping into some of the higher echelons in Christian thinking. So just be careful. Just be careful. These truths are remarkably valuable. And we handle them with great care and great worship. And when we turn them into fodder, to raw material for just arguments that will support why we are paid by people, then something's tragically gone wrong. That's all I'm saying. That's just one example of that. Whew. Next week, Paul will start his last awkward situation, and he won't be able to exhaust it in one sitting. He'll start it for many verses. He'll detour back to something else, to help take care of Timothy. And then before he finishes, he's got to go back to it. It's just such a big issue. What is the biggest, most awkward situation that Timothy has to confront? People who love money. Let's quit by singing this. This is how I can tell the discussion is awesome and it's also authentic. I stand in awe of the simplicity of the gospel, that he would die for me and pay the price for what I've done so that he might reconcile me to himself. And so that causes me, in the midst of all the exploration and all the discussion, to stand in awe. Amen. That's what truth was meant to do. So let me pray, and we'll come up and we'll finish with that. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your words to us, how they are so instructive, how they open our eyes and the eyes of our heart to things we never suspected. Lord, deliver us from the silly controversies and quarrels of the age. And Lord, engage us in conversations of love, firm love, but love about the truthfulness, about who you are, what you've done on our behalf. We want to exercise your economy on our words, to not waste the little breath we have on the things that have very little to matter, but that we might in all respects take the treasures and the jewels that your truth is and to lay them before those who stand before us and say, isn't this wonderful? Isn't this wise? Doesn't this cause you to want to worship the God who made us? These are just extraordinary truths. And Lord, we pray that as simple communicators of your gospel, that those around us would come to understand that has nothing to do with our charisma or our ability to communicate or any of those things that these first century sophists used to manipulate people. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do just with the simple truths of your word and what you have to say. These words just astonish us over and over and over again. If God takes care of the flowers and the birds, he'll take care of you. So seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. All that stuff will be added. Lord, these words are such a tremendous encouragement to us. And so unlike the place we live. So thank you for your great love for us and your care for us, and you're engaging our minds in these things. And we thank you now in Jesus' name. Amen.